He was a billionaire CEO with everything, until a 5-year-old girl in a pink dress looked up at him through her tears and whispered, "Be my daddy for an hour." Andrew Collins had spent most of his life moving too quickly to notice anything that did not belong to the narrow world of business meetings, boardrooms, and contracts signed under pressure. The chauffeur-driven cars, the tall glass buildings, and the endless cycle of deals had created a kind of cage that he wore as armor. That evening, after a long negotiation that had drained even his usually sharp focus, he decided to take a detour through the city park, hoping the quiet would cool his restless mind. He was dressed, as always, in his immaculate light blue suit, the fabric pressed perfectly, his brown hair combed with the precision of a man who believed appearances were part of power. The last thing he expected was that this short walk would fracture the routine of his entire existence. As he followed the path lined with trees just beginning to show spring blossoms, his eyes caught a small figure sitting alone on a wooden bench near the playground. It was a little girl, no more than 5, with blonde hair pulled into a tidy bun that seemed too carefully made for such a young child. She wore a pink dress that looked slightly wrinkled from hours of wear, her small legs dangling off the edge of the bench as though she were too tiny for the world around her. What stopped Andrew cold was not her size or her solitude but the expression on her face. Her big blue eyes shimmered with tears, her cheeks damp as she tried in vain to wipe them away with her hands, the effort only making her look more fragile. Something inside Andrew twisted, something he had long thought buried. For years he had walked past scenes of poverty, struggle, or pain without allowing himself to feel, convincing himself that sentiment was weakness and weakness was a luxury he could not afford. Yet in that moment he felt a pull stronger than reason, as though the sight of this child cracked open a locked chamber inside him. He hesitated, his instinct telling him to continue forward, to mind his own business, to remain the man he had taught himself to be. But her sobs broke the silence of the park in a way that made ignoring them impossible. His polished shoes slowed against the gravel, and before he realized what he was doing, he was standing in front of the bench. The girl looked up at him, startled at first, but then her expression softened, as if she had been waiting for someone, anyone, to notice her. Her lips trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might retreat into silence. Then, with a voice that was as fragile as glass yet carried an urgency that struck him like a blow, she whispered, "Be my daddy for an hour." The words hung in the air between them, too heavy for such a small voice, and Andrew felt his breath catch in his throat. He stared at her, unable to comprehend what he had just heard, unable to summon the cold dismissal that had always come so easily in moments of discomfort. The park around them faded into irrelevance. The laughter of distant children on the swings, the rustle of leaves in the evening wind, even the pressure of his schedule, all of it disappeared beneath the weight of a single plea from a child he had never seen before. In her tear-streaked face he saw not just a stranger but the reflection of a wound he carried within himself, one he had spent years pretending no longer existed. For the first time in a very long time, Andrew Collins, the billionaire CEO who prided himself on control, felt powerless. And yet, in that powerlessness, something stirred, something that might become the beginning of a story he never expected to live. Andrew remained frozen for a long moment, the words echoing inside him with a force that unsettled everything he thought he knew about himself. The little girl looked at him with an expression of both hope and fear, as though she had taken a risk even in speaking to him, and now waited for the verdict that might either comfort her or crush her further. He lowered himself onto the bench beside her, carefully, as though afraid she might break if he moved too quickly. Up close he could see the way her small hands twisted the hem of her pink dress, how her blue eyes shimmered with fresh tears that she fought desperately to hold back. She seemed so tiny against the vastness of the park, so vulnerable in her solitude, and yet the courage it must have taken to speak those words filled him with a strange kind of awe. He cleared his throat, his voice softer than he had expected, almost unrecognizable even to himself. He asked her name, and after a hesitant pause she told him it was Lily. The way she said it, with a fragile pride, made him realize how rarely she was asked to declare herself to anyone who cared to listen. He asked gently why she was alone, and her answer sent another jolt through him. She explained in halting phrases that her mother was sick and had been in the hospital for a long time, and that she had no father to come for her, no one who could sit with her the way other children had someone waiting for them at the playground or at home. Her voice trembled, but her gaze did not waver, as if she wanted him to understand the truth without pitying her. Andrew felt something break open inside his chest, a rawness he had not allowed himself to feel in years. The memory of his own daughter surged to the surface, unbidden and sharp, the memory of the child he had lost in an accident that had ripped through his life and left him grasping at work and wealth as a shield. He had buried that grief beneath layers of control and ambition, convincing himself that detachment was survival. Yet here, in the voice of a little girl asking him to be her father even for an hour, all those defenses crumbled. It was as if the universe itself had placed this child before him to confront the wounds he had tried to hide. For a long while he simply listened, letting her speak in fragments about the nights she sat by her mother's hospital bed, about the way the nurses smiled kindly but always looked too busy, about the silence of coming home to an empty apartment where she tried to pretend her dolls could talk back to her. Each sentence was a weight pressing down on him, but it was also a tether drawing him closer to her. He realized she had not asked him for food, for money, or for promises of the future. She had asked only for presence, for someone to sit beside her and be what she needed most, if only for a short while. Andrew nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotions he could barely control, and told her that he would stay with her, that she was not alone anymore, not for this hour and not for as long as she needed him. The relief that washed over her face was almost unbearable to witness, a mixture of disbelief and sudden joy that made her blue eyes shine even through the tears. She leaned slightly against him, not fully, but enough to suggest trust had already begun to bloom. For Andrew, the moment was both devastating and redemptive. He knew nothing about how to heal the emptiness she carried, but he also knew with absolute certainty that he could not turn away. As the sun dipped lower and the park grew quieter, Andrew felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of purpose blooming within him. It was not the kind of purpose he had chased in towering office buildings or billion-dollar deals. It was something purer, something that whispered to him of redemption, of the possibility of becoming more than the hollow shell he had built around himself. Sitting beside a little girl in a pink dress, hearing her soft sobs quiet as she clung to the idea of having a father even temporarily, Andrew realized that his life had just shifted onto a path he had never imagined but one he could no longer deny. The following day Andrew woke with an unease that refused to leave him, the image of Lily sitting on that bench still etched into his mind as clearly as if she were in the room with him. He had spent most of the night pacing the length of his study, surrounded by shelves of law books and financial reports, none of which could distract him from the echo of her small voice asking him to be her father for an hour. He told himself that it was a fleeting encounter, that she was not his responsibility, yet the argument felt hollow the moment it formed in his head. Every time he closed his eyes he saw her blue gaze, full of both hope and sorrow, and the gnawing sense of unfinished duty pulled at him harder than any business obligation ever had. By morning he had made a decision without consciously realizing it: he would find her again. The city stretched out before him as his car cut through the early traffic, but Andrew was not heading toward the glass towers of his empire. Instead, he directed the driver toward the hospital Lily had mentioned in passing. The sterile white building rose above the street with an intimidating stillness, the kind of place where lives teetered between hope and despair. As he entered through the automatic doors, the scent of antiseptic struck him sharply, and he felt an unexpected wave of anxiety settle in his chest. He had not been inside a hospital since the accident that had taken his wife and daughter years earlier, and the memories threatened to claw their way back to the surface. Still, he pressed forward, driven by something stronger than fear. When he reached the ward, he spotted her immediately. Lily was sitting beside a hospital bed, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized chair. Her pink dress was wrinkled from a night spent curled in place, and her hair bun had come loose, strands of blonde falling around her tear-stained cheeks. She held tightly to the limp hand of a woman who lay motionless on the bed. The woman appeared no older than 30, her golden hair spread across the pillow, her face pale and drained of life though still carrying delicate beauty. Tubes and wires ran from her body to machines that beeped steadily, the sound of fragile survival. Andrew froze in the doorway, struck by the weight of the scene. This was not a child crying in a park anymore, this was a child bound to the edge of tragedy, trying desperately to hold on to the one person she loved most. Lily noticed him then, her face lighting up with a spark that both warmed and broke him at once. She whispered softly, as if afraid to disturb the silence of the room, "You came." The words made his chest tighten, because they carried not just surprise but relief, as though she had truly expected him to disappear from her life as quickly as he had entered it. He stepped closer, his eyes shifting to the woman on the bed. Something inside him recoiled at the sight of her frailty, at the knowledge that this was Lily's mother, fighting a battle she might not win. He pulled a chair beside the girl and asked gently how long her mother had been like this. Lily explained in simple words, her voice catching now and then, that her mother had grown sick months ago and had been in and out of the hospital since. She said the doctors always looked worried but tried to smile for her sake, and that she had learned to sit quietly so as not to bother them. Andrew listened without interruption, each word cutting deeper than he cared to admit, because it became clearer with every sentence that this little girl had been living in a loneliness no child should ever have to endure. For hours he remained there, silently keeping her company, answering her scattered questions with patience he had not known he possessed. He found himself telling her things about his own life that he had never spoken aloud in years, the memory of his daughter, the way grief had swallowed him whole, the reason he had built his walls so high. He did not tell her everything, of course, because a child should not carry the burden of an adult's despair, but what he did share seemed to bridge the gap between them. She listened with wide eyes, and when he paused, she squeezed his hand and whispered that maybe they had both been alone too long. As evening fell and the room dimmed with the fading light outside, Andrew realized he no longer saw Lily as a stranger. She was not just a child who had asked for a father for an hour, she had already begun to take root in the part of his heart he thought was dead. Watching her rest her head on the bed beside her mother, refusing to let go of that fragile hand, he understood something with absolute clarity. No matter what happened, he could not walk away now. Fate had led him here, to this small girl and the broken woman who was her mother, and for the first time in years, Andrew Collins, billionaire and CEO, felt the stirrings of a purpose that was greater than himself. Andrew returned to the hospital every day after that first visit, and with each passing hour he spent there, the sterile white walls of the ward began to feel less like a foreign prison and more like a place where something fragile yet profound was unfolding. The staff soon grew accustomed to the sight of him in his light blue suit, sitting quietly at the bedside of a woman who remained unresponsive while a little girl clung to his arm as though he had always belonged there. At first the nurses had glanced at him with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief, for they knew his face from magazines and news reports, the face of a billionaire who ruled an empire of steel and glass. Yet here he was, day after day, bowing his head over a frail woman's hand and listening to the chatter of a child who barely reached his shoulder. Lily had quickly accepted his presence as natural. She would climb onto his lap without hesitation, holding the phone where she pretended to call him at work, announcing in her small, serious voice that, "Daddy is here now." Andrew felt the words pierce deeper than he expected, stirring memories he had long locked away. When she asked him to read her stories, he found himself stumbling over fairy tales he had not opened since his daughter had been alive, and though the lump in his throat sometimes made the words falter, he continued because Lily's smile was enough to keep him steady. She seemed to sense instinctively when his heart grew heavy, leaning against him and whispering that her mommy would get better soon, as if she were trying to lend him the same hope she clung to so fiercely. But when Lily left to nap in the lounge or when she was taken briefly by a nurse for a meal, Andrew was left alone with Hannah, and those were the moments that unsettled him most. He would sit beside her bed, staring at the delicate lines of her face, at the way her golden hair spilled across the pillow, and he could not stop the storm of questions from rising inside him. Who had she been before illness hollowed her cheeks and tethered her to machines? How had life led her here, abandoned and fighting alone? And most painfully, what would become of Lily if the woman before him never opened her eyes again? The thought struck him with a force he could not shake, and he realized with growing clarity that the little girl's plea in the park had not been a passing whim, it had been a cry born from a truth too harsh for her years. She truly had no one else. That realization weighed on him until it seeped into every corner of his life. In the mornings, when his assistants tried to hand him folders filled with contracts and proposals, he found himself distracted, his mind wandering back to the hospital ward and the sound of Lily's small voice. In boardrooms, where he once commanded respect with a single word, he now felt distant, watching the discussions as though they belonged to another man entirely. The power and wealth that had defined him seemed almost laughably small compared to the fragile hand of a child in his own, compared to the silent challenge posed by a woman clinging to life. He began to understand that he was being forced to confront the emptiness he had been living with, the hollowness that no fortune had ever been able to fill. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the hospital windows in shades of gold, Lily fell asleep with her head against his chest. Andrew sat still, not daring to move for fear of disturbing her, and in the quiet he whispered a promise he had never thought he would speak again. He told Hannah, though he did not know if she could hear, that he would not let her daughter grow up alone. He said the words softly but firmly, each one carrying the weight of a vow. And as he looked down at the little girl who had asked him for only an hour of fatherhood and had instead taken hold of his entire being, he realized that whether Hannah woke tomorrow or never again, his life had already changed forever. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm Andrew could not have imagined himself living before. Every morning he would arrive at the hospital with the precision of a man who once measured his time only in the currency of deals and deadlines, yet now his purpose was something entirely different. He would bring small gifts for Lily, a stuffed bear one day, a book of fairy tales the next, sometimes simply a box of crayons and paper that she used to fill the sterile walls of the ward with color. Each time, her face lit up with gratitude that was far too genuine for him to brush aside, and the joy that spilled from her smile was unlike anything his wealth had ever bought him. But beyond the laughter and the attempts to bring light into her small world, there was an undercurrent of fear he could not ignore, for every day that Hannah remained motionless was a reminder that their fragile hope might not be enough. Andrew often found himself caught between two worlds. During the day he was still expected to show his face in the skyscraper that bore his name, to stand in front of investors and assure them of stability, but in truth his mind never left the hospital. His assistants whispered about his absence, his board questioned his priorities, yet none of it touched him. He realized that the empire he had built, the one that had demanded every ounce of his ambition, now seemed hollow compared to the weight of a child's trust. When he sat in the hospital room and Lily reached for his hand without hesitation, the satisfaction he felt dwarfed every triumph of his career. He had once thought power was measured by control, but here, beside a sick woman and her daughter, he was beginning to understand that true power lay in vulnerability, the courage to care when you could lose everything. Hannah's condition became the quiet center of their lives. Doctors came and went, their expressions carefully neutral, offering updates that danced on the edge of despair but never quite surrendered to it. Andrew pressed them for answers, but medicine had no promises to give. At night, when Lily had finally fallen asleep in the chair by the bed, he would remain awake, studying Hannah's face in the dim light. Sometimes he spoke to her in whispers, telling her things he had never admitted to anyone, that he had lost his own daughter, that grief had twisted him into a man of stone, that he had believed he no longer had the capacity to love until Lily shattered that illusion with a single plea. He told her that she had to fight, not for herself alone but for the little girl who clung to her hand as if it were her lifeline. He did not know if she heard him, but there were moments when her fingers twitched ever so slightly, and he clung to those small movements as though they were signs from the universe itself. The strain began to take its toll on him. Nights without sleep left shadows under his eyes, and his once impeccable suits began to show the faint wrinkles of a man who no longer cared about appearances. But rather than weaken him, the exhaustion seemed to strip away the last remnants of his armor. He found himself more honest, more human, than he had been in years. He spoke to Lily not as a businessman who towered above the world but as a man who understood pain, and in return she offered him a kind of acceptance that humbled him. She would press a crayon drawing into his hand, clumsy figures of a tall man, a small girl, and a woman lying in bed, and she would say with utter conviction that this was their family. The first time she did it, Andrew nearly broke down, overwhelmed by the simplicity and the truth of a child's vision. As the 5th week drew to a close, something shifted inside him. He realized that he no longer thought of his time with Lily as temporary, no longer saw her as a stranger he had stumbled upon by chance. She had become his responsibility, not out of duty but out of love that had crept up on him slowly and then consumed him all at once. The memory of his own daughter still hurt like a scar that would never fade, but for the first time it felt less like a wound and more like a lesson. He had been given a second chance to be the father he had once been robbed of being, and he knew he could not squander it. Sitting there in the hospital room, holding Lily close as she whispered her dreams for the future, dreams that always included him, Andrew understood that no matter what happened to Hannah, his life was now bound to this child. The billionaire who had once thought himself untouchable was now defined by the tears of a little girl and the faint rise and fall of an unconscious woman's chest, and he would not have traded it for the world. The night Hannah's condition worsened began like any other, with Andrew sitting in the stiff chair beside her bed while Lily sketched pictures on the tray table with her crayons. The machines hummed in their endless rhythm, and for hours nothing seemed different, yet Andrew could not shake the uneasy feeling building in his chest. Lily eventually grew tired and curled up with her blanket, her small body pressed against his side as if she had known all along that this night would demand comfort. Andrew kept his gaze fixed on Hannah, noting the slight change in the pace of the monitors, the shallow rise and fall of her chest that seemed weaker than before. When the doctors finally rushed in with their clipped voices and practiced urgency, he realized his instincts had been right. Her body was faltering, caught between surrender and survival. For the first time since meeting Lily, he felt fear crash over him like a tidal wave. He stood back as the medical team worked, their words a blur of terminology he barely comprehended, and all the while his eyes returned to the little girl who stirred awake at the sound of alarms. She sat up, confused and frightened, asking him in a trembling voice why the machines were louder, why the nurses looked so serious, why her mother's hand was growing colder. Andrew knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms, and whispered that she had to be brave, that whatever happened she would not be alone. He realized as he said it that it was not just a promise to comfort her but a vow to himself, binding and unbreakable. The hours that followed felt endless. Hannah was stabilized, though the doctors admitted quietly to Andrew that her chances of waking were growing slimmer by the day. He stood outside her room while Lily slept again, listening to their cautious explanations and fighting the urge to demand certainty they could not give. In his world, problems were solved with strategy and money, yet here in the fluorescent corridors of the hospital, his power meant nothing. No amount of wealth could pull Hannah back from the edge, no influence could rewrite the frailty of her body. The realization left him shaken, yet strangely, it also clarified what mattered. He could not control life or death, but he could control how he stood in the face of both. Andrew returned to the room and sat beside Lily, who had fallen back into restless sleep with her hand clutched around his sleeve. He watched her tiny fingers grip him as if she knew instinctively that he was the anchor holding her steady. In that quiet moment, he thought of his own daughter, of the night he lost her, and the way he had crumbled under the weight of grief. He had become a man defined by fear of loss, a man who built walls to keep himself safe from the devastation of love. Yet now, as he looked at Lily and at the fragile woman who might never wake again, he knew he had no choice but to embrace the risk. To love meant to hurt, but it also meant to give life meaning, and without that, his billions were nothing more than dust. The next morning, when the doctor spoke again, Andrew asked what would happen to Lily if Hannah did not survive. They exchanged glances, reluctant to answer, but finally explained that there was no family to take her in. The words ignited something inside him, a clarity sharper than any boardroom decision he had ever made. He told them firmly that she would not be left to the mercy of strangers, that she would have him. The conviction in his voice startled even himself, but the truth was undeniable. Lily was already his daughter in every way that mattered. That evening, as the sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows, Lily climbed onto his lap and whispered that she dreamed her mommy would wake up soon. Andrew held her close, smoothing her hair, and replied that no matter what happened, he would always be there for her. She looked up at him with tearful eyes, searching for any hint of falsehood, and when she found none, she rested her head against his chest and sighed as though a burden had been lifted. In that moment, Andrew realized the man he had been was gone forever. The billionaire who once measured success in towers of glass now measured it in the trust of a child's embrace, and though the future was uncertain, he knew he would never again allow fear to keep him from love. The 7th week in the hospital brought with it a weight that pressed on everyone who had been living inside those sterile walls, and for Andrew it felt as though the very air was charged with a question that could no longer be postponed. Hannah's condition had plateaued, leaving her balanced on a razor's edge between life and death, and though the machines continued their monotonous rhythm, the doctors admitted quietly that they were losing hope for her to ever regain consciousness. Andrew listened to their words with a composure that belied the storm inside him, nodding politely, shaking their hands, but when he returned to the room and looked at Lily curled up beside her mother's bed, the truth broke him in ways he could not hide. He realized that whatever happened now, the time had come to prepare for both the unbearable and the miraculous. That evening, as the sun bled through the blinds and painted the room in gold and shadow, Lily asked him if her mommy would be all right. Her voice was steady but her eyes searched him desperately, as though she could read the truth in his hesitation. Andrew gathered her into his arms and told her gently that he did not know what would happen, but he promised with everything he had that she would never be left alone. The words were not enough to ease her sorrow, but they seemed to steady her, because she nodded and pressed her small head against his chest. In that moment he felt a fierce surge of determination that surprised even him. If Hannah did not wake, he would honor her life by raising Lily as his own, and if she did wake, he would stand beside her and fight for her recovery until his last breath. For the first time in years, he was no longer running from pain but facing it head-on. Days slipped by, each one blurring into the next, until one night Andrew found himself alone with Hannah while Lily slept in the chair under a blanket. The ward was quiet except for the steady hum of machines, and he felt the strange urge to speak to her as if she could hear him. He told her about Lily's drawings, about the way her daughter laughed even when she was afraid, about the strength that small child carried within her. His voice broke when he admitted how deeply he had grown to love Lily, how she had brought him back from the emptiness that had consumed him for years. He leaned closer, clutching Hannah's hand, and whispered that he would take care of her child no matter what, but begged her not to give up, not to surrender when so much still waited for her in the world. For a long while nothing changed, and he felt foolish, but then her fingers twitched faintly against his palm. It was a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but to him it was like the crack of light through a locked door. The next morning, Lily stirred awake and insisted that her mommy's hand had felt warmer during the night. Andrew did not want to give her false hope, yet when he touched Hannah's skin himself, he too noticed the faintest difference, as though something had shifted. He called the doctors, who examined her with their usual clinical detachment, but even they admitted that there had been a subtle improvement, one they could not easily explain. For Andrew and Lily, it was enough to ignite a fragile flame of hope that burned brighter with every passing hour. Still, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He began preparing quietly for both outcomes, speaking to lawyers about guardianship papers, ensuring that if the worst happened, Lily would be protected. Yet he did this without telling her, because he knew that what she needed most was his presence, not his paperwork. When she drew another picture that showed the three of them holding hands in a garden, he smiled through the ache in his chest and told her it was beautiful, because in her innocence she saw the family she longed for, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was still possible. One night, near the end of that long week, Andrew sat in the chair with Lily asleep on his lap. He stared at Hannah, willing her to open her eyes, and for the first time he prayed, not the mechanical prayers he had muttered years ago at his wife's funeral, but a raw, desperate plea to whatever force governed the world. He asked for strength, for mercy, for one more chance to see this family whole. And as the machines continued their steady rhythm, he realized that no matter what answer he received, he was no longer the man who had built a fortress around his heart. He had been changed irrevocably, and his life would never again be measured in power or wealth but in the fragile, breathtaking gift of love. The morning that changed everything began with the softest sound, a sound so small that Andrew thought at first he had imagined it. He was sitting beside Hannah's bed with Lily leaning against him, both of them half asleep as the pale light of dawn crept through the blinds. For weeks the machines had been the only rhythm in the room, steady and mechanical, but now he heard something else, the faintest whisper of breath that seemed stronger than before, a shift so subtle it made his heart stumble. He leaned forward, hardly daring to hope, and then it happened. Hannah's eyelids flickered, her lashes trembling as if they were fighting through a heavy fog. Andrew's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he was frozen, afraid that even the sound of his voice might scare her back into the darkness. But when Lily stirred and looked at her mother, wide-eyed and trembling, Hannah's eyes finally opened. They were weak, unfocused at first, but undeniably alive. The room seemed to stop existing around them. Lily scrambled out of Andrew's arms and threw herself onto the bed, her small hands clutching her mother's arm as tears streamed down her cheeks. She called out, "Mommy," over and over, the word breaking and reforming as if it had been trapped in her throat for too long. Hannah's gaze shifted slowly, recognition dawning in fragments, until her eyes found her daughter and softened with a love that had never died. She tried to lift her hand, and though the movement was clumsy, Lily guided it to her face, pressing it against her tear-streaked cheek with a sob of joy. Andrew watched, his chest tightening, feeling as though he had just witnessed a miracle, one that defied medicine and reason and yet was as real as the sunlight spilling into the room. The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Hannah was weak, her body fragile after so many weeks in a coma, but the doctors could not deny the progress she was making. With therapy, rest, and relentless determination, she began to regain her strength. Each day she spoke more clearly, each day she remembered more, and though her recovery was not without setbacks, she refused to let despair take her again. Andrew was there for every step, steady and unyielding, and Lily never left her mother's side unless he carried her out to rest. The three of them formed a rhythm of their own, one built not on certainty but on shared hope and unspoken vows. Andrew found himself reflecting on how far he had come. Not long ago, he had been a man defined by loss, a man who used his empire as a shield against pain, but now he was someone entirely different. He no longer saw Hannah as a stranger lying in a hospital bed or Lily as a child who had stumbled into his life by chance. They were his family, as much as the one he had lost, and perhaps even more so, because this time he had been given the choice to fight for them. One evening, when the doctors finally allowed Hannah to leave the hospital, Andrew walked beside her wheelchair with Lily skipping ahead, her laughter ringing out like bells. The sound filled him with a sense of peace he had not felt in years, a peace that no amount of money could ever have bought. At home, the transformation was even more profound. The mansion that had once been silent and cold now echoed with footsteps, laughter, and the quiet conversations of people learning to live together. Lily filled the halls with drawings that depicted the three of them holding hands, playing in the garden, or sitting at the dinner table. Hannah, though still recovering, found comfort in these small rituals, and her gratitude for Andrew's devotion grew stronger each day. And Andrew himself discovered that he no longer cared about the endless chase for power and wealth. He attended to his business when necessary, but it no longer defined him. What defined him now was the way Lily would run into his arms at the end of the day, the way Hannah would smile at him across the table, the way the hollow echo inside him had finally been replaced with warmth. One night, as the three of them sat in the garden under the stars, Lily placed a crown of flowers she had made on Andrew's head and declared with solemn authority that he was her forever daddy now, not just for an hour. The word struck him with such force that tears filled his eyes, and though he tried to hide them, Hannah reached across the table and squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with her own. In that moment Andrew understood the depth of what he had been given. He had lost once before, and the pain of that loss would always remain, but he had been granted a second chance, one he would never take for granted. The night ended with Lily asleep in his arms and Hannah leaning against his shoulder, her strength slowly returning, her presence grounding him in a way he had never thought possible again. Andrew looked up at the stars, feeling as though the universe had finally answered a prayer he had been too afraid to voice. He had been broken, he had been hollow, but now he was whole, not because his fortune or empire had grown, but because love had found him again. And this time, he would protect it with everything he had.